citizens and miners too. The next section we will go to the farmers, which, although a lot of times people think this time period is one of the most boring, I have found the more that I study about it, the more interesting it is. So in last year my classes did extremely good on this section. So maybe it's part that I am starting to get more enthused about this time period, or just, I don't know. We'll see what it is. But for the Cowboys, when you think of a cowboy, close your eyes. No, this is not the nap time. Okay, but close your eyes and picture a cowboy. Mikey, close your eyes. What color is your cowboy?
White.
And all right. How does he or she look?
Cowboy hat.
Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Look like John Wayne, which we even have that. Probably the most iconic figure that it has with a cow. Why is it that this would be? There's the Marlboro Man. Why is it that this is kind of our picture of a cowboy?
Movie.
Okay, movies. Okay, that's where today we have the movies. And even at that time, and I'm not sure if this is in our notes or not in here, but this is where we have. Actually, the real Cowboys, and I know I'm going to mispronounce it, the Caros. Most of them were Spanish background. There were a lot of black cowboys. You don't see that in the movies, do you? Our more recent movies we do that are a little more accurate. But most of our cowboys were not what the image is. And the reason why comes about, even our very first movie ever made. Okay, and this is trivia, but it's good trivia to know. The very first movie made was The Great Train Robbery, which has to do with out west, and I mean, obviously robbing a train. But you have cowboys in that, and that image came. Before that, Americans always had this fascination with out west. Remember our frontiersmen, even Davy Crockett and his stories, and we had Jedediah Smith and the fur trappers. That adventurous spirit of America. Well, the cowboy kind of filled that role of what used to be our trappers and our mountain men. And people wrote about them in dime novels. Now, dime novels were cheap paperback books that you could buy. At that time period, would cost about a dime. Most famous dime novel that we've had so far in here when they first came was Uncle Tom's Cabin, getting a great influence. Well, as they become where more and more people are reading them, they read about the cowboy. And then we have Buffalo Bill, because his Wild West show not only made it for the Americans' viewpoint of a cowboy, but also throughout the world. As he was kind of like the Three-Ring Circus. Remember when we had our People reports on William Cody? There it was. He had sharpshooters. He had Sitting Bull that came there. They would bring out. They brought buffalo come. And so people had this image of what the West was, and what the cowboy was. But the real cowboy was extremely poor. They did not own their own horse for most of them. They basically owned what could be. Well, they usually had their own saddle, because you want to have your own saddle. And then your saddle bags, and for most of them, everything they owned could basically fit in their saddle bags. In many ways, they weren't much different than a migrant worker, and made it easy for them when they were doing the cattle drives. All right, for the cow trails, here's where we get to the straight out an SFI to know. There are a bunch of different cow trails. The most famous is the Chisholm Trail. And what these cow trails did is they went from various areas to Texas, and they went up to Kansas, sometimes up to Nebraska. And the reason why they were going is the cows that were in Texas were being driven to where the rail yards were up in Kansas. Probably the most famous cow town is Abilene that you would have, I think. And in these cow towns, we would have, these would be boom towns that would suddenly grow up. A lot of your image of the Wild West really came about with these cow towns. Wild Bill Hickok was at Abilene, who really was pretty much himself a criminal, but then you give him a badge and he's able to control other criminals in that way. But Wild Bill Hickok, who's one of the most famous of all the Old West sheriffs. Now, as these cowboys are driving the cattle from Texas to Kansas, what's the most dangerous thing along that trail?
Indian.
What?
Stampede.
Stampede. And what could cause cows to go into a stampede?
Snakes.
All right, snake can.
Wolves.
Wolves.
Cougars.
Indians. Cougars. Stepping on a stick. Those of you, and said this will be my one little short cow story, any of you that have ever been around cattle, they are dumb animals. Okay, they really are. And if you see a bunch of cows in a field, if one cow starts going over to the other side of the field and another one looks up, what do all the cows do? They go over to the field. And if that one cow that's up in the front starts running, what do all the other ones do? They run. Why?
Because they know it's there.
Right, it's like a bunch of high schoolers when someone yells fight. Where? Okay, they all start running. Okay, I mean, it's just a herd of people that do it. I still remember Seamus lawyer used to always go in the cafeteria, and there he would always go with things when it got a little bit too quiet and it just nothing crazy going on. And he would start yelling fight, and people would look up and go, and he would just start laughing about how everybody would react because just one person yell it out, okay, and how a bunch of Citrus High students would go crazy. But that's the way cows are. And cows, when they are running, they just are thinking, gotta run, gotta run, gotta run, gotta run. Okay, they are not. I used to work on a cattle farm, and I will tell you that cows will run through a tree, or try to. When you put a fence with barbed wire, use staples. You don't make it real solid because the cow will kill themselves before they go. If you're ever around, if a horse is charging at you, stand still, although instinct tells you to move, because a horse will come in at the last second, will go one way or the other. A cow running full speed at you, you can be blowing a horn, you can be waving your arms and everything else, it does not see you, okay, because all it is thinking is running. Well, if one of them steps on a stick and it startles it and it starts running, the other ones around it start running and they don't know. And how do you get a stampede to stop?
You don't.
You basically, for the Cowboys, when they have a stampede, you try to get them you try to get them start running in circles. And basically the whole group of them, you just round them and just kind of keep them in this area and run where it's safe. They're not running off a cliff, because yes, they'll run straight off a cliff. But you get them running in circles until they basically decide, oh, we got to stop, and enough of them decide to stop, and they all decide to stop, and it's over. Okay, I mean, but as Cowboys, you had to stop a stampede because you don't get paid until after those cows get to Abilene or one of those cow yards. So what might be 3, 4, 5 months of work, depending on where you're going and where you're coming from, you don't get paid until the very end. So what happens if after 3 months of work, all your cows run off a cliff and die? Then you got paid nothing. And you probably won't get hired by that person to drive their cows again either. So, yeah. Now, once they got it, and think about a bunch of people that don't have a whole lot of money, and suddenly they get paid for 3, 4 months of work. And then they get to Abilene. What's the first thing they do when they've got some money in their pocket?
Buy alcohol.
Now, before they go get alcohol, they get something else. Yeah, they go to a bath. This is where we had bath houses. Because if you've been basically living outside for 3 or 4 months, you go to a place where they've gone and they've boiled some water and you get a good shave and everything else. There you go. Then you probably buy some alcohol. You think there are a few houses of ill repute there to help take them of some and relieve them of some of their money. Okay, so and although when we had Brokeback Mountain a few years ago, and I had a teacher that was with me for years, and he was from Missouri State University, and he would always, whenever I was doing stuff about cows, come in to tell. And that one of the highest rates of homosexuality was with Cowboys. Okay, so there is some there with the Brokeback Mountain. The cow towns would be a great place to set up a house of ill repute. Those of you that don't know what that is, that's a whorehouse. Okay, so if you are wondering, it would be a great place to go. And if you're a gambler, these people that come and they think they know what to do, especially after they've had a little bit of alcohol, easy to get rid of their money. Or if you're a person that just wants to rob somebody, someone has a whole lot of cash that they normally don't have and they're holding in their pocket, it's a great time. And the unfortunate thing for a lot of these Cowboys, after they work 3 or 4 months, they get paid. a lot of them would lose that money in the first couple of days and then try to find a way back to Texas where they started all over again. And that was kind of a repeating thing that they would have. Now, why did it start? Here's actually one of the bigger things to know. Why is it that we suddenly had these cow drives going from Texas to Kansas?
So they get butchered?
War.
Well, it actually had to do with war. This is where the Civil War comes in. What happened in those northern cities during the Civil War? Did they make a lot of money in businesses and industries? And when they had that extra money, they got the taste for beef. And as people were richer, so they wanted to have meat. That was something that normal people didn't have. So it made it where there was an increased amount because of the money. Then there were other things that helped to make it. One thing is we could can meat. So even for what would be our middle class, we could can things and preserve it longer. Think about, I mean, if you were to have something like, most of you with canned meat, you think of tuna fish. But once you have that sealed, it can last a long time, can't it? I mean, even if the expiration date says 3 years from now, it actually, if everything is done right and can the right temperature, it can last even longer than that. We had refrigerated rail cars so we could ship the meats from place to place. What city, once they got onto the rail cars in Kansas, what city did they end up going and became basically the center for slaughterhouses in America? Yeah, Chicago. Now let's see if we connect it to something. Here's a little review before the test. Why Chicago? And why are the trains from the west going through Chicago? Right, say that louder? Yeah, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen Douglas's plan, 1854, is working out. And Chicago becomes a major city then for all these cattle to come in, and the slaughterhouses where they would then process the meat, which, even though we're jumping ahead here for the end of this unit, who would end up writing a book about those?
PETA?
No.
Upton and Sinclair.
Right, Upton Sinclair would then be writing about those slaughterhouses later on and those processing plants there. But that's where Chicago would come in. All right, they ended for a variety of reasons. One is Joseph Glidden. What did Joseph Glidden invent that helped end the cow drives?
Pastures.
No, pastures were already there.
Well, fences.
What type of fence?
Barbed wire?
And that's where it made it, barbed wire. And one thing you're going to find is that a lot of the stuff that we have for this unit is interconnected. Another section we have will be Carnegie with Still. Now, even though we'll have Edison with electricity, all right, no, they're not electric fences yet. But this is where, out west, we did not have a lot of wood to build fences, but when Joseph Glidden invents barbed wire, we end up being able to have a lot of this. And that stopped a lot of those. Plus, once we started getting the railroad lines built all the way to where the cows were, you don't need to move them hundreds of miles. We had the trains come where the cows are, not the cows go to where the trains are. All right, for our mining section, here we go. Here's our history on mining out west. Okay, we had a bunch of different gold and silver finds that, in the 1860s and 1870s. The most famous of which, and the one SFI to remember, is the Comstock lode. A lot of silver was found in Nevada. It made it where in the middle of the Civil War, Nevada came in as a state. It would not grow much in population until after Las Vegas would take off later on. But that is where Nevada would be with the Comstock lode. The Black Hills of South Dakota found gold there. Now, this was where it would be a problem. We're going to see this in the future. Because the Black Hills, before that time, didn't seem like very good farmland or anything, so we promised it to the Indians to have forever and ever. Of course, what happens when we find gold on the land that we promised them forever and ever?
It's not yours.
It's ever.
Yeah, forever suddenly ends. And we have people coming in there, and what do these Indians, I mean, what do they end up doing when we come to the land that we promised them that is considered sacred land by them? All right, for some reason or another, they just don't like this. And that's what our next section is, and we will end up with the Battle of Little Bighorn occurring from it. So that's where what was the effect on the Indians. We end up taking their land whenever we find the gold or silver there. The effect of the backing of money. Go back to our old economics lesson. What is our money backed by today? Yeah, trust in government. What was it backed by in the past? Gold, and this is where the argument comes from make it gold and silver. So the idea of bimetallism. And as we were finding more and more silver, we're going to have groups saying that we need to back our dollar bills not only with gold but also with silver. And this is going to be an issue that we have. Some of you never realized how much banking issues come into history until this year, did you? So, but this is where it will be a major one. Other side effects for the mining out west, what are vigilantes? What? They're not spies.
People who fight for like, who want to kill people that are bad.
Right, they take justice out in their own hands. And a lot of these towns, and the vigilantes would also, these boom towns that we're talking about here for mining, it's just like the cow towns. Okay, except for now somebody might get a whole lot of money because they suddenly struck it rich. So the vigilantes would try to come and basically be the source of law, sometimes for good, not always for good. Miners' tax on foreigners. We would end up on people that were making money but that were not from America. We would have a tax on just them. And one group of foreigners that we definitely went after at this time would be the Chinese. In 1882, we make the Chinese Exclusion Act. And if you don't know what the Chinese Exclusion Act does, it excludes Chinese. Basically, we say no more Chinese are allowed to come to America. Now, America, we had a backlash against the Irish, but did we say no more Irish and make a law?
No.
And this is where I want to kind of point out that you're going to see this, that it will have. And we'll have it happen again in 10 years later, and then the following 10 years after that, we will make the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent until World War II when they're fighting on our side. Or there was a few things in there before. Yeah.
What was the direct effect on the banking of money?
Well, it was in effect, we tried to back with silver and gold, since silver was being discovered. And we won't worry about the Florida side today. So you go. In Florida, we did not have cowboys. We call them cow hunters. What do we call them? Cow hunters. Yeah, basically what you did for Florida, it was actually like Texas, you let the cows go. If you didn't want the cows in your field, then you fenced in your field and you kept the cows out of your field. We were actually an open range state until the 1950s. What that meant was if in the early 50s, if you were driving your car down the road and you hit a cow, it was your responsibility to go pay the farmer for the cow you hit that was in the road. Today, it's just the opposite because we're no longer open range. Okay, the farmer is responsible for the damage it did to your vehicle if their cow gets out the fence. But what Florida did is we let our cows out. They ran around in the swamps. We did the same things with pigs, which is why we have all of our wild hogs that run around. And what you did is once a year, you round up the different cows. And this is where the branding comes in. In Texas, they did the same thing. You would go and it didn't matter who the father was. Okay, if the calf was with your cow, then you could brand them. Now, anyone know what you do with pigs? Instead of branding, what you do with a pig? To say whatever you're doing. Yeah, you would notch their ears. Okay, so that's where, to claim your pigs, you might put it in where Haley would have 3 notches in the left ear, but Taylor would have a V in the left ear and 2 notches in the right ear. Okay, and you actually did some of that instead of branding, you would actually do that some with the cows. Now, the cows that we had in Florida were not as good for eating. In fact, hardly any of our meat was sold here in the United States. It was sold down in Cuba and other islands in the Caribbean, except for during the Civil War, the Confederate Army would use it. If you see these cows in what are called cracker cows, okay, they are smaller cows. They have bigger horns in them. Today, what we have done, we actually, for our cattle, we have brought in some Angus and other type of cows that are more disease resistant and also can withstand the heat more, but still have a higher quality of meat there. Later on, they would become known as crackers for the Cowboys. Why were they known as crackers?
Crack that whip.
Right, because of the whip. Okay, and then basically when they would crack the whip. And that's where they'd come. Places that you would ship them to out of Punta Rosa, which is near Fort Myers. We still have in Florida, close to where Highway 60 is, crossing from Fort Pierce over to Bradenton. They do an annual cow drive along Highway 60, which is still a lot of our cattle country, Okeechobee, that area. Still for Florida, our top two agricultural products are oranges and cattle. We're the biggest cattle producing state east of the Mississippi. Now, a lot of our cows, what we do here in Florida now, we breed them and then send them then to Nebraska for the last 2 months of their life, where we go to move them to where the food is and fatten them up before they get to go to McDonald's. As for boomtowns, any gold or silver found in Florida?
Yeah.
No, but we have, right here in Citrus County, we actually had a boomtown. If you were to come 100 years ago in Citrus County, what was the biggest city?
Floral City.
Yeah, it's Floral City, by far.
That's funny.
Was it
And
the same size?
it was bigger than it is now.
Okay.
There were more people living in Floral City 100 years ago than there are today. Because you had thousands of people that came in that worked in the phosphate mines they had. Dunellen was even larger, and even though that's technically not in our county, a lot of those people lived on the Citrus County side of the Withlacoochee River. Dunellen actually was in this area the biggest area for a few years. But that's where they found the phosphate, and this is where Dunellen even has boomtown days. Now, few people got a lot of money out of this, but just like out west with the gold and silver, most of the people that made money were not the people that were going and mining for this, because in these mines they had to hire people to work for it. Where was the phosphate sent to?
Farms.
No, not farms, although it is used for a fertilizer mainly today. A little bit of mining that we have left in here in Citrus County. Over in Red Level they do dolomite, which is a really high level phosphate and used fertilizer. But anyone know where the largest amount was? Yeah, but where? No, it wasn't the north. This is what's kind of strange. Most of it was actually sent to places, especially Germany and Europe. Which, what would happen is they would put it on barges down the Withlacoochee River, send it to the Withlacoochee River, and then put them on larger boats and go over to Europe. Which is why when we had this boom town, when World War I happened, guess what happened to our phosphate industry?
It went down.
Not only does it go down, it's almost wiped out, because are we sending our phosphate over to Germany when we're fighting them? And then after World War I, it never recovered, and more of the phosphate in Florida, we actually found where more of it can be mined in Tampa, Lakeland area like that. So that's where you don't. Some of you may have houses, depending on where you are, especially if you live in the Citrus Springs area, that you actually, someone owns the mining rights. If they ever decide to mine, they can actually mine under your house in that area. It seems kind of weird, but some people still have that, just in case the price of phosphate skyrockets, where it becomes worthwhile to go. But that's where some areas still try to claim mineral rights. All right, we had Cowboys, now we'll do the Indians. The Great Plains Indians, for the most part, except for people going on the Oregon Trail, we ignored them. When you hear the term the Great American Desert, it's not a desert. Because what was the Great American Desert?
The Great Plains.
Yeah, the Great Plains. Why did people think it was a desert for years? Because what?
Or no, it looks that color.
It's all flat.
Yeah, it's flat land. Are there trees?
No.
But was there stuff growing there?
Grass.
Yeah, I mean, it was the grasslands.
Yeah, grass.
Today, this is where it is our breadbasket when you think of Nebraska, Kansas, that. But at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of it. Thing that would change it. First of all, the choo-choo train. Because the train not only brought people, but it also brought supplies. If you didn't have a forest to cut down to build your houses, the train could bring wood, could bring supplies that you didn't have. And here's where I want you all to start putting these things together with not just one part, but other things. The Still Plow. Who was the person that made the first Still Plow? Okay, John Deere. Now, why would a Still Plow make a difference in the Great Plain compared to the old plows? All right, it was hard land. Those roots, they would go down sometimes 18 inches for this grass. those big iron plows could not get sharp enough to go through it very long. Meanwhile, with Still, you could make it very sharp, and even though the plow was lightweight, it would cut through and flip over that. Now, your first year of farming on a field like that, you're not going to get much. Because any of you that have ever seen if you dig a hole and you go someplace that hasn't had anything done for a long time, the roots are thick, all right, it's hard to break up that dirt. But if you flip it over and then it has a year to kind of rot, the next year when you plow it, all right, that would be some very great soil to have. The cattle boom, as we were moving the cattle to different areas, and even then when the trains came and we started fencing things off, again, the barbed wire that we had in the last section here. Plus, the gold and silver finds, some of the areas that were on the edges of the Great Plains. We would then move to those areas. Okay, Plains Indians, first of all, buffalo. That was part of their lives for thousands of years. I talked about how cows are dumb. Cows are geniuses compared to buffalo. Okay, they're kind of the same way that they will go into a stampede. One of the worst things about a buffalo, though, is they cannot see very well at all. So it would be something that if something went and scared a buffalo, and you would have herds of thousands of them. One of the ways that some of the Indians figured out how to go and get buffalo before they had very good weapons, because even before they had a horse, can you imagine trying to kill a buffalo with a bow and arrow or a spear? All right, these are large animals, it's hard to kill them. So one of the easiest ways, if you could ever get them to stampede off a cliff. Yeah. Okay, and that's actually what they would try to do if they get buffalo and get them into an area where they would do that. When the Spanish first came and horses broke loose and were wild, at first the Native Americans were using the horses as meat. But then they figured out how to tame them, and they actually became expert horse people. And then they would use the horses to help them get the buffalo. And this is where you should have had this back in 5th grade. And when I say that buffalo are a part of those Indians' lives, what did they use it for?
Everything.
Yeah, everything. Okay? Their homes, their food, their clothing. I mean, this is where they did not waste any part of it. Okay, they made tools out of it there. So, yeah, I'm not going over that section to it. Have the question, what would happen to the buffalo in the 1860s and the 1870s?
Extinct.
Now, they wouldn't become extinct, but they would be radically reduced. Why? What made it where they were so reduced in such a short period of time? Yeah, they were hunting. And what did people want the buffalo for?
Fur.
Not food.
Fur.
All right, their fur and the hides. This is where William Cody actually becomes famous for, because he's hired by, as we're building the railroads, he's hired by the companies to go and kill the buffalo for meat for them. But then after the railroads go through, he realizes, well, if we just clean the animals, take the hide and not really the rest of it, then just leave the rest to rot. There was one part that was actually seen as a delicacy. Beside the hide, what part of the buffalo?
The horn.
Not the horn. The part that was a delicacy that people in the East would pay good money to eat.
Rocky Mountain oysters.
No, not the Rocky Mountain oysters. The tongue. Buffalo tongue was seen as a delicacy. So can you imagine being a Native American and your life is on the buffalo, and this is where there's actually a great scene in Dances with Wolves where they come upon all these buffalo that are laying there dead, that have basically all the meat just rotting off of them, the hides taken off, and their tongues cut out. Everything else is just left to rot. And that is why, I mean, very quickly, the population of them went down, which that's the life of these Native Americans they see dying. Of the tribes, you do not have to know every single tribe that is out west. The one main tribe you truly do need to be familiar with are the Sioux. All right, that is the most important tribe. What would happen with the Sioux, and this is where they kind of fit into it, they are the most important, probably the largest in numbers in there, but they were also ones that ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What their holy lands were the Black Hills, which gold was discovered there. Some of their leaders would be with it. And just like Tecumseh, we're going to find that the Sioux were able to get these other tribes, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Pawnee, the Shawnee, some of them to fight then with them. So it wasn't just one tribe fighting the U.S. Army. There would be multiple ones. When you see concentration in history, you learned in world history about concentration camps. So what is the concentration policy? Yeah, you concentrate in one area. It might be enclosed, which we didn't actually enclose with the reservation. So you kind of look at this, and realistically, the philosophy we had here in the United States wasn't much different than what Adolf Hitler had. And in Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler does tell about how the right way to get rid of a group of people is to do what the United States did. And kill off those that you can, and the ones that you can't, well, you put them on land that no one wants. And that is where our concentration policy, when you see that, you ought to be thinking of reservations. The thing is about the reservations that we gave them, did we use to give them any good land? Because we gave them the undesirable land. Of course, if we found something desirable on that land, we would then go after it, which is kind of what happened in the Dakotas in the Black Hills. You see here, here's a map. Was this Montana, I think? Or, oh, it's northwest, so not just Montana. I can't see real good. But you see where instead of giving them all that area out west, well, we'd give them chunks of land that we have. You see, I mean, even here with this is Oklahoma, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And what used to be all their land now is in smaller ones. Okay, conflict. Here we have battles. Notice I have those in quotation marks. We could have a bunch of different ones. I'm only giving you a small number of these that you need to know. Get kind of an example. 1864, while the Civil War is going on, we would have a group of Cheyenne in Nebraska and at the Sand Creek Reservation. There were some Pawnee Indians that had stolen some horses from a nearby white settlement. The soldiers, though, do they know the difference between Pawnee and Cheyenne? So they decided that they were going to go. The men were out on a hunting expedition at that time, and so there was hardly any men that were at the Sand Creek Reservation. To show that they were peaceful, they were flying two flags over there, an American flag and a white flag. And the U.S. Army goes in and just basically starts shooting up and kills a lot of the Cheyenne Indians that had nothing to do with the horses that were stolen. And that was a battle. Sound like much of a battle? The Washita River was another one that would happen later on. And in this case, we have several different Indian tribes that are together. They went to this reservation. Part of it was they were promised that they would bring them food since there was not enough that they could get. They don't go outside the reservation. Of course, it wasn't. These Indians were starving to death. And the U.S. Army would go into the Washita River, and there would be another massacre. Kind of giving you an example, though, here. This is where we have several times that we would have these massacres occur. Again, there were other times that happened. Those were just two of the largest. For the Native Americans, though, their highlight, though, is the Battle of Little Bighorn. You need to know three people involved with this. For the American, it is General George Armstrong Custer. Actually, I believe he was a colonel there. But he is the leader of the 7th Cavalry. Now, Custer is a very strange man in some ways. And this is where it's kind of strange for us to think of this. He was hoping to run for president. And what can he do to make it where he can be popular enough to run for president? Yeah, basically wipe out a group of Indians. And so that is where, when he went to this one place where he thought it was a small group of Indians on the banks of the Little Bighorn River, and he had this plan to go, and he was going to go one real big battle. He'd wipe out these Indians, and the news of that would go out in the east, and he was going to come back and run against Ulysses Grant for president. Kind of tells you the mindset of Americans at that time, that that was something that would be great for someone running for president. Meanwhile, this is where Sitting Bull comes in. Sitting Bull was the planner of this, and he planned a trap that where Custer would come in, a small group of Indians would leave the village, and the cavalry chases after them. They'd come into this valley, and around this valley, then literally thousands of Indians of different tribes, not just the Sioux, would come down, and they surrounded the Custer's troops. Now, you can almost think of it like the general for the Indians was Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull came up with the plan. Crazy Horse is the one that makes it happen. And during this time, then they end up pretty much wiping out, or do wipe out, the 7th Cavalry. Now, those of you, there's actually a good movie we might watch it after the AP exam called Little Big Man. It's a lot like Forrest Gump. It's an older movie, but that one is supposedly the only white survivor from the Battle of Little Bighorn. But this is General Custer, who was famous for, I mean, his long golden hair that he had. Again, remember that I told you that the press followed around military leaders in the Civil War. The Civil War is over, so now they're following around the Indian fighters. The soldiers had to, when they got caught down the valley, they ended up shooting their horses. Why did they shoot their horses?
High line.
Cover.
Yeah, for cover, because they were basically caught out in the middle there. So they shot their horses for something to hide as they were completely surrounded. But they ultimately would end up dying. Some of you may have seen this at the park for the Little Bighorn. They now have a monument there for Crazy Horse. Okay, now I have the question, what happened after this victory? This is the biggest victory in the history for Native Americans and all the Indian wars they had. So after they win this giant victory over the 7th Cavalry, what happens?
They take back
Trail.
No, not the Trail of Tears, that was long before. What did you say, Trace?
I said they took back America.
They took back America? Well, that's what they hoped, because they wiped out the army. Except for, did they wipe out the whole army? No, they wiped out a couple hundred soldiers.
How many?
So what did the U.S. Army do?
Came in.
Send more. Meanwhile, that coalition of all those Indian tribes, what did they do after the battle?
Left.
Yeah, they all went back to their own places. War's over. And then the U.S. Army would go after group, force them onto different reservations, and the concentration policy would continue even more in earnest at that time. I have a couple of things on here, and this is where I'm not trying to go too deep into this, but one of the things that was happening, and you want to know what Indian hunting is in California? Literally what people would do is they would decide to go out and let's go, for fun, let's go shoot Indians. And it would be almost like, I mean, I know some of you might go and do this and go out into this forest and say, hey, let's go, and hopefully you're not shooting cats, but you decide to go out, and all right, let's go shoot at raccoons or possums or something like that. Except for, they would go out and, because of these tribes that were peaceful tribes, just go out and start shooting Indians for fun. And guess what the punishment was?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Right, there were laws on the books, but was a judge actually going to worry about persecuting someone that went out and just was shooting Indians for fun?
No.
And that's what, it was kind of almost like a joke out in California. And some of the Indian tribes out in California, which were peaceful tribes, had their population decimated. All right, basically for people deciding to just go in and for fun, all right, going out and shooting them. You might remember one day when we had for the history of the day about Chief Joseph. He and the Nez Perce tribe tried to escape into the Rocky Mountains up into Canada. And we sent our army after them. And news is coming back about us chasing them down and capturing them and forcing them back on their reservation. And this is where, again, I want you to see that our policy that we had for the Native Americans wasn't real good. Okay? Again, Hitler used this as an example. Our last battle, and here for the AP wise is actually the most important things to know. And notice these, and make sure you know these SFIs. They all kind of go with each other. I have battle in parentheses. What happened in 1890? A whole group of Indians showed up at this area called Wounded Knee. All right, it is at a river. They kind of made this camp, and they did the ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance was, I mean, it was a ceremony that they did, and the idea of the ghost dance was, if they do this, their spirits would go, the white man would disappear, the buffalo would come back. Okay? Yeah, it does. Of course, if you have enough peyote or something, then it might work. But This is where they were doing this. Now, it's kind of like a bunch of teenagers together. What happens if a whole bunch of Indians get together in one place? Does the U.S. Army trust them? Just like if a bunch of you all get together at one area, a whole bunch of teenagers are in the parking lot somewhere. Does the deputy come driving by again and again? All right, because hey, if you got a whole bunch of teenagers together, there's got to be something bad that's going to happen, right? All right, there's no way that y'all can just peacefully be in a parking lot somewhere. All right, something's got to happen. And this is where the U.S. Army was there. And the Indians were trying to show that they were peaceful. They were not having the weapons there, and they were supposedly didn't have any. Sitting Bull. Okay, now from the time of Little Bighorn to Wounded Knee, which we're talking about, what, 13 years, I think? During that time, he had gone and he had served in the Wild West show. Now he's come back, and he's kind of the spiritual leader of this. They search his tent. While they're searching his tent, they find that he does have a pistol hidden in his tent.
Oh no.
So they come out and like, hey, what's this? And they seem a little bit tense at that time, and then a shot gets fired. Somewhere, and it's actually, if I remember right, I believe it was one of the soldiers that accidentally fired off. But the rest of the soldiers that are all tense, then they open fire into the Indians. And over 300 unarmed Indians are killed.
Holy cow.
Now, that is our last battle. And I like to use that as an example, though, because that, in many ways, representative of our whole policy and what happened with Native Americans. Okay, we have a case here where there's not trust with each other. Something happens, and basically the U.S. Army ends up wiping out a group of people. And that's why it's that even though this is one last battle. Now, later on, you're going to see Wounded Knee come up again in the 1960s, because we will have then, when the Indians are working towards different things and equal rights, we will have Wounded Knee come on at that time. All right, here's where a few little things to know, and this is where we're kind of throwing in. White Help, Century of Dishonor. Okay, Helen Hunt Jackson would write in the 1800s. She would write about all the bad things that had been done throughout our history, telling about it. And this is where this book would kind of change some of the policies that we would have. It would take a while for the effect of it. Would be the most things that would be done until we would have John Collier come in the 1930s. Here's the other thing for the AP side to know. I put stars by this, arrows, highlighted, whatever you need to know. The Dawes Act. Okay, later on, we're going to have the Dawes Plan. You're going to need to know the Dawes Act, different from the Dawes Plan. But for this time period, Dawes, and sometimes you'll see Severity Act on there. The idea was to help out the Native Americans. Now, is there ever a time in government that something has been done that is supposed to help out? Haley, go stand in the back. Something that's supposed to help out a group of people that actually doesn't. Some people have a plan there that isn't. Come on back there, Haley. And so what would end up happening in this case was a group of people in Washington, D.C. said, let's figure out how we're going to help them. Now, the first thing they wanted to do was to assimilate the Indians into society. What does that mean by assimilate?
Like,
Become a part, integrate them with it. And we're going to see the same thing with our immigrants. This word in this section is used not only with Native Americans, but also with immigrants. We want to Americanize them, is how I always like it. So we're going to go, and part of this was send them to schools. Now, some of you that know about some of the Indian schools that we'd have in the late 1800s and early 1900s weren't real nice. Because if you were Native Americans and we had a reservation school, what would happen if you decided to wear some of your traditional clothing? Well, you didn't get shot, but you would be punished. What if you decided to talk in your native tongue in class? If I asked a question and you decided to talk in your native tongue.
you get spanked.
Yeah, you get spanked or beaten in some way. And the idea was you're going to become an American. Okay? Luckily for us, there were some things that were handed down. When we get to World War II, we're going to see, especially with the Navajo, thank goodness some of them actually broke the rules and would continue to learn their language from their grandfathers, because in World War II that would help us out, that some of these Native Americans did have it. But and this is where you notice I'm adding these things, kind of some of the connections that we would have here. But the Dawes Act would do. The biggest impact, though, was we were supposed to help out, and this is where Washington, D.C. had tricked them, They're going to give every Indian family 160 acres of land. Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
Now, anyone know why it's 160 acres?
That's enough to grow some crops.
Well, we would have passed the Homestead Act, which we're going to go back to this next section. All right, we had in the Civil War, the Republicans passed the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act would be where you could get 160 acres of land for free. Now, they were supposedly giving them this 160 acres. The only thing is when you started going by families, in some of the areas, you actually ended up taking land away from the Indians. Now, first of all, on the reservations, did we give them good land to start off with? And 160 of acres might sound good. If you're a farmer in Alabama, is 160 acres good? If you're a farmer in New Mexico, is 160 acres good? No, you're not going to grow very much. Here in Florida, all right, if you have 160 acres, you could have, 500 cows on it. If you have 160 acres out west, you're having 2 or 3 cows on it.
Why?
So 160 acres, because there's not enough nutrients. Here in Florida, when a cow eats some grass, how long does it take for that grass to grow back? Yeah, if they eat a little bit of grass out in West Texas or out in Arizona, New Mexico, it might take a whole month before that grass starts growing up enough for things. So you cannot, if you have too many cows, it will end up wiping it out. And here's where we end up getting to the reservations. And you see here in the red, and here, this is 1934. By this time, you think about all this land that we had left for Native Americans, that's what they're kind of left with at that time. And remember the Dawes Act? This is kind of like how Wilmot Proviso was in the Mexican War, that this comes up. This is the most thing that you have test-wise there. And it's kind of showing about where a law, it was supposed to help, it didn't, and there are, again, connections for later on.
So it actually took their land away?
Yeah, even though it was supposed to help them. And this is where some people that thought they were helping people out ended up not helping them. Do I have the one map of this? No, I don't. All right. Some of this in here. I think this area that's in yellow is area that they no longer. Remember, we gave in the 1830s Oklahoma or Indian Territory for the Indians to have forever and ever and ever. Well, after the Dawes Act, they lost about half the land in Indian Territory. So we helped them out by taking away half of the land we had promised to them 50 years before. What to do with that extra land? Sell it. Or give it away to whites or blacks, because remember we have our free blacks now. And one of the things that happened here was the Oklahoma land rush. So the land, we basically went for these tribes that were out here, for the Cherokee. Okay, once you added together 160 acres for each family, oh, well, you have this land here. So all this area that isn't that, they gave it to for people, and then we would have the land rush. And I'm going to show one time the scene from the movie Far and Away, and you're going to see some things of this for land rush. But some people would cheat and go early to claim this land. Those people were called Sooners. So those of you for University of Oklahoma fans, that is where Oklahoma is, their nickname is the Sooners, or their mascot is the Sooners, which kind of goes, if you know the history of Oklahoma football, for cheating, it kind of goes hand in hand with Oklahoma football, because they've known to do a little cheating in their past there. But that's where the Sooners were the people that cheated and left early. And you're going to see when I show you that video from one movie, you're going to see that some of the people that went out early and claimed the best parts. But that's where one of the last land rushes that we would have. All right, a couple other little terms here. Exodusters. Anybody in the Bible know what Exodus is?
It's the end.
The end of what?
It's a mass exit.
The last book.
Mass exit. Who led?
The second coming.
Jesus.
No, not
Moses.
Jesus. Moses. When they left Egypt and went back to the land of milk and honey in Canaan, however it is. But that's where, and that is where the idea this comes in, is the biblical part of Exodus. Now the Exodusters, we had the part for Reconstruction. 10, 15, 20 years after the Civil War ended, was the South a very good place for a black family to live? No. Were they given their promise of 40 acres and a mule? They given the right to vote, but could they actually vote? Most places no. So for a lot of blacks, they decided to move away. They used the Homestead Act. A lot of them would end up moving to the areas of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. So that's where the exodusters come in. And when we get the next section, we'll kind of go with the farmers and a little bit more details of the Homestead Act and what some people would use to try to get there. But that's where the exodusters are. They are some of the black Americans. They would leave the South and go into that area. That's where even today, some cities like Wichita have a higher African American population. Frederick Jackson Turner, coming up yet again. You think you have to know him?
Yeah.
Figured if we give him enough times, you might actually learn with him. Okay, what is his main theory?
Frontier thesis.
Okay, the frontier thesis. We as Americans, we always have the idea we can move west. But here's something else that's added on. The pioneer spirit. And what is sometimes termed rugged individualism. What makes us as Americans great is the fact that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstrap. If you were going to moving out west, okay, and what you would fight for. But the question comes in, what happens after basically all that area out west is conquered? And I have here, 1890, the census said there was no more frontier. We had expanded and we basically covered and gone from coast to coast. So we had achieved manifest destiny. But where are we going to go from there?
Space.
Well, before we go to space, we got to go
The ocean.
other areas. Go over the ocean, and that's where we're going to get to the late 1800s, Spanish-American War. All right, taking over some other areas. We'll go back to Cuba. All right, some of those places that we missed around the first manifest destiny.
We never take land.
I know. We let the Queen of Hawaii give it to us. Okay, we would buy it from Spain at that time. But yeah, that's where. But this is where the frontier thesis kind of, again, it fits in a whole bunch of different places, and that's why I keep throwing it in here. So eventually, you're going to see Turner and get in your mind, okay, frontier thesis. All right, here's another thing just thrown in here, but some of these stuff I didn't know where to put in what section, so that's why there's a hodgepodge of it. Rocky Mountain School of Art. We're Americans. What are we good at? Yeah, landscapes. Rocky Mountains are where? Out west. So guess what type of landscapes these are?
No.
They're out west. And then we'd have others, and this is where Friedrich Remington, I always remember Remington because some of you know with Remington guns. Okay, so I always think Western with it, but he's the most famous of it. Once again, is this an actual school? No, it's a school of art, like the Hudson River School. So you kind of think the Hudson River School is the early 1800s, the Rocky Mountain School is later on. We'd have a lot of things. Now, I kind of have this. How does this contribute to the American spirit? Look at these pictures.
Murder.
Well, murder? Okay, well, all American.
Murder.
What is the image of an American in other places of the world? Yeah, we're cowboys. So you think about that. As America's emerging into a world power at the end of the 1800s and 1900s, when they see pictures of other parts of it, I mean, it's the image of the cowboy. Even our best art is portraying a cowboy. Not just our cultural side with Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show, here, but we have our art and this new American culture. It's kind of like a circus that we would have. Sitting Bull, you know, who's Annie Oakley?
She was
Who knew
like
she
really
died?
good shooter.
Right, she's a sharpshooter. And here's where you kind of look at things, even for women. Not that she's fighting for women's rights, but this is where I want you to kind of look and expand outside of this. Here she is, she's one of the best shooters, did all kinds of trick shooting. Again, she, all right, a woman. All right, I mean, this is where it kind of showing the different images that we have. Okay. All right, that's the end of this section.
That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's a whole hot.